Good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Mike Sfraga. I'm the director of the Polar Institute, and I am very pleased to welcome you, nearly 500 of our colleagues worldwide, to today's event. The title of our event is Realities of Life in the 49th State. This program is the first in our Alaska Native Corporations in Context series. As many of you know, the 49th state is the largest and least densely populated in the United States. So self-sufficiency and the ability to hunt and fish are critical, especially considering the harsh winters and remoteness of many Alaska Native villages. And if you were to look on a map of Alaska, you would make note that many of our communities are not accessible by road or rail. Most of them are accessible only by air or snow machine, boats, ships, ATVs, or dog teams. Regardless of challenges, Alaska Native people are proud of their traditions and ways of life. Today, we're joined by 4 important Alaska leaders who will share their stories of life in Alaska and how their communities and villages have prospered despite the many barriers they face. We will also explore the inextricable and unique role Alaska Native corporations, created by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, established by Congress 50 years ago, play in providing critical services, resources, and economic benefits to Indigenous communities throughout the state. As always, we appreciate the continued support of our foundational partners like Laguna Corporation and A2A Railway for making programs like this possible throughout the year. I also want to thank the Anxia Regional Association for their partnership in today's program and in our series of complementary events. And as always, our friends, our colleagues, and member institutions of UArctic for their support of Polar Institute programming. And our colleagues at the Wilson Center, the Environmental Change and Security Program, and our History and Public Policy Program. We encourage you, our friends and colleagues, to have this discussion with us. So we encourage you to participate in the program by emailing your questions to polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll do our very best to add them to this robust and informative discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce Kim Writemeyer, Executive Director, Anxia Regional Association. Kim, I hand to you the virtual floor.
Thank you, Mike. And an enormous thank you for the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center for hosting this event. On behalf of the Anxia Regional Association and the Alaska Native Village Corporation Association, we are delighted to be here. My name is Kim Writemeyer. Despite my headset, I'm not landing planes today. I am the Executive Director of the Anxia Regional Association, which represents the 12 Alaska Native Regional Corporations. Our member organizations proudly represent over 135,000 Alaska Native shareholders. ARA's purpose is to promote and foster the continued growth and economic strength of our organizations on behalf of their Alaska Native shareholders and communities. I am Sukak. My family is from Koniak, Alaska. I am a member of the Shunak tribe of Kodiak and a proud shareholder of my Native corporation, Koniak. When it comes to Alaska Native corporations, we often say that we are a different kind of corporation with an equally unique definition of the term shareholder. Alaska Native corporations were established by Congress in 1971 through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act to be socially responsible for-profit entities tasked with promoting the social, cultural, and economic advancement of Alaska Native people and communities. Congress created our organizations, differing from the traditional reservation system, acknowledging our cultural connection to our land, because they came to understand that our Indigenous communities were different, whether it be because of the size of our state, our climate, or our traditional ways of life. Many of these differences still exist today, and it's important that we are accounted for when crafting plans, policies, or regulations that will impact Alaska Native people and communities. As you'll hear from our panelists, COVID has been uniquely challenging for many rural Alaska Native communities. And even before the pandemic, many daily comforts taken for granted in the lower 48 are luxuries in Alaska, such as road access or broadband connection. Despite these challenges, Alaska Native people are proud to call Alaska home, and even more proud of our history and culture that lives on today. Alaska Native corporations are as different and as bold as the people we represent. And we hope today's panel will give you a deeper understanding of why the uniqueness of living in Alaska and Alaska Native people require a different approach. So thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our fabulous group of panelists so they can make introductions before we move into Q&A portion of our event. I'll start with you, Willie. You are on mute, Willie, if you'd like to unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Kuyana, the Wilson Center, for putting this event on. I said, my name is Raruk. I am a Kikik-Tagarugmi, that is a person from Kotzebue, small island person, and also a saltwater person. And I was born and raised at a time when life was completely different than now, very much different. And it was a time of living in sod houses. In fact, my little office here, there probably was 5 or 6 of us living in this 14 by 16 space here. We had 3 different sod houses. This was the dog team world. This is the world in which our people made their livelihood from the land and from the waters and rivers and from the birds. And it was a different world than now. That was before TV, before electricity, before snow machines. It was a hard life, but a good life if you had your health. And I had the good fortune of being raised by Nonrarak and Akpayuk, my parents, and a big family. And we made our livelihood, not really understanding that we were in for some huge changes in our lifetime. And those changes have come to pass. And Alaska and our villages are not what they used to be, but still the dependence on the land and the sea life and the food from the oceans are still critical to the well-being of our people. But yes, indeed, there has been many changes. And I have managed to observe those from those ancient days to now. And we've done everything we could to try to accommodate those changes. But of course, with a lot of change, there's a lot of sacrifices and a lot of pain, and we've experienced that.
Oh, thank you, Willie. Pato?
Hi, Palaripsi, greetings. My name is Patuk Glenn. I'm from Utqiagvik, Alaska. It's the northernmost point in the United States. For me to introduce myself, I have to make sure that I give acknowledgement to my husband, Bill Martin, and my family, my parents, where I came from, Richard and Arlene Glenn, the late Patuk and Frankie Akpik, and my other grandparents, Alice and Robert Glenn. I run the Arctic Slope Community Foundation as the executive director, and it's a new role that I've taken on. But in my past, I've been able to carry out various capacities. Previously, I worked in community economic development for Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, and I've worked as a museum curator for the North Slope Borough. So I've worked in the various sectors, public, private, and now back again in public for our nonprofit that serves our region to help improve the quality of life. In many ways, people may call me an afterborn. And if you may not understand what that terminology means, most people in Alaska understand that as somebody that was born after the passing of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in '71. I was born in 1984, and even in my lifetime, I've seen dramatic changes. However, I'm forever grateful for leadership like Willie Hensley, Oliver Levitt from our region, and many countless others that fought so hard for self-determination so that we could have the various organizations that serve us in rural Alaska, which by very way I am a result of. I've only been able to be successful in my various careers because there were these organizations like folks like Willie and others have set up. I grew up in Utrecht most of my life. If you look on a map and you see where it is, or if you even look at Google Earth or what have you, it's completely flat. It's wintertime most of the year. And we not only live there, thrive there, but we've been able to become masters of our domain through countless generations of our elders understanding the world around them and making best use of all of the things that we now know to love as our culture, as what makes us who we are. And with Anxia and self-determination happening just as recent as the 1960s and the 1970s, it's amazing to see where our people have been able to take it to this day. However, I do want to let people know that there are some serious challenges that we face in rural Alaska today. And I think most of the world, most of the United States even, they're unaware of how we live and why we live that way, and even our basic value system. I know that Shauna and Kim will tell you more about our corporate structures that were built and how it is completely different than other major corporate entities in the United States. And I'm lucky because I've been able to have employment in learning about our history so that I may be able to promote it to our next generation, because even our own youth many times struggle with self-identity, knowing who they are, where they came from, because you're living in two worlds. You're living in your traditional native value system and beliefs, your subsistence way of life, but you're also living in the United States of America, where our lives are so very different than New York City, Washington, DC, even Kansas and rural Kansas, very different. So looks like they're queuing up a video. This video, I'm here because I made it big on TikTok some way, somehow. I have no idea. I just put out information of what I thought I was speaking to the Native community in encouraging others, and somehow I made it into national attention, and this video has gone viral. It's got 3 million views on TikTok. I'll go ahead and have them show it. It demonstrates a little bit about who we live, where we are, how life's different. This video is, I recorded this right behind my mother's house. There's a sigalok, it's an underground cellar. I'll let the video speak for itself.
My mother's house is a sigalok or ice cellar. This cellar is basically a hole dug into the ground 20 feet below the surface of the tundra. This is where we preserve our whale, seal, caribou, any sort of native food, really. This works because about 1 foot below the surface of the ground is permafrost, where the ground is permanently frozen throughout the year. This provides a storage big enough to keep food for the entire year, specifically where the crews keep their bowhead whale. Things in
So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Kim. Thank you.
Thank you, Patok. Shauna?
Jamai Hui Shauna Hegna Ilanka Ahunach Muat Chali Port Lions Mech. Hello, my name is Shauna Hegna. My family is from the villages of Afognak and Port Lions. And I am not nearly as cool as some of my fellow panelists, so I can't rock a TikTok video, but I do have a PowerPoint slide that highlights some of the photos of my family and of my community. I grew up in the village of Port Lions, which is located on Koniak Island. So Koniak Island is home to the largest brown bears in the world. And it's actually about 250 miles south-southwest of Alaska's largest city of Anchorage. There's about 200 people who lived in Port Lions when I was growing up. Today, there's about 170. So for those of you that have never had an opportunity to grow up in a village of 200 people, to put it in perspective, there were 5 people in my high school graduating class, me, my identical twin sister, my first cousin, my third cousin, and my boyfriend at the time, who may have been the only person I wasn't related to in the entire school. I think I've been incredibly blessed throughout my career to be involved in and work with many wonderful people and organizations. One of the greatest highlights was in 2017, I had the opportunity to be an American Fellow in the German Marshall Memorial Fellowship Program. So a hearty Koyana Deluchi, thank you all for coming. For those of you especially who are dialing in from our EU embassies, I'm looking forward to spending a couple of hours with you. Today, I serve as the president of Koniak, which is the Alaska Native Regional Corporation that represents the 4,300 people, Alaska Native people that call Kodiak Island home. So Koyana, thank you. Kim?
Thank you, Shauna, and thank you, Willie and Patuk. I am so excited, so I just really want to jump in. We've got some good conversation today, and I know there'll be some Q&A coming in. So Willie, we are beyond honored to have you here today. And I would venture to bet that there's probably only a handful of people in Alaska who don't know your name. But today we have a little bit broader audience. So I was hoping you could start by telling us what it was like growing up in rural Alaska and leading us up to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. You have such an incredible story, and I really look forward to hearing from you. Willie?
Oh, Rihanna, thank you. Well, like I mentioned earlier, it really was another world. We have about 200 villages in Alaska. My hometown, probably at that time in the 40s and 50s, probably might have had 300 or 350 people. Now it has about 3,500. It's sort of like the capital of an area about the size of Indiana. And in those days, we never even remotely thought that our land was in jeopardy. To us, this had been land that we had become familiar with for over 10,000 years. And every amount of it was utilized in some way for the survival of our people. And we traveled extensively in spite of not having roads or anything like that, any mechanical equipment. It was all dog teams and sleds. And people made these absolutely fantastic sleds, kamutik we call them, you know, to haul ourselves around with the dogs. Everything that we had to make by hand. And even as a boy, our clothing were still being made by our mothers and our women relatives, and they literally had to process everything themselves. I mean, the seal skins, all the fur, we absolutely had to have fur to survive. We wouldn't have survived, you know, without fur. And those clothing were just fantastic. They were light, but they were warm. They knew how to make waterproof stitches that kept us dry in the spring and summer. And, you know, people moved around extensively to where the food was. In my family, we lived around at a place called Ikkatuk. It was just a short little stream not far from a larger river called the Noatak. But in that stream were whitefish galore in the fall. We had, there were tomcods, there were she-fish, which is like a tarpon. There was salmon in the summer. There was lingcod in the river. There was whitefish. There was flounders. We hunted seals, belugas. You know, we hunted caribou was the absolute staple. That herd, that 300,000 or 400,000 head of caribou that still migrate through the area we depended on. So it was a life of a lot of action. It was a hard life, and you had to be strong. And if you had your health, it was a great life. But in those days, we absolutely had a minimal necessity for cash. Primary cash was from fur, but since we didn't have electricity or cars or outboards to any degree at that time, no snow machines at that time, so the cash that we got for trading our furs was pretty much used for a few Western goods, like coffee and chewing tobacco and you know, bacon and some rice and some beans, you know, a few things like that. But the rest of it we caught ourselves, and we never even remotely at that point knew that our lives were going to be changing, because this was before statehood came, and that we never thought that our land was going to be under threat. And we were a pretty optimistic and chatty, happy people back then. We interacted, you know, family was absolutely critical, because you need every hand, you know, in their family to make a life out there. And that land was, in our minds, our land. And interestingly enough, just for those that are scattered far and wide, Shauna comes from down at Koniak, which is maybe 1,000, 1,200 miles from where I'm at, but she's in the North Pacific. And their language, the Sukpiak language, is if you say a word like Kiktak, like my hometown, Kiktak is an island. Well, they use the same word. You go up the Yupik country on Yukon Kuskokwim all the way up to Patuk's area, up the top point of the United States now at Utkarvik, and then you go to Mackenzie Delta in Canada, all the way to Hudson's Bay, to parts of Quebec and Labrador, and all the way to Greenland. If you say Kiktak, they know what you're talking about, because that's one culture that actually has gone all the way from the North Pacific to the North Atlantic. And I tell people, if we had just a couple hundred more years, we could have founded Europe. Anyway, that's what it was like. It was in my time growing up, we were pretty much dependent on the land. We didn't have, we made our own, we had very few furniture. In the sod house I lived in, we had no bed, we had no table, we had no set of drawers. We had a few wooden boxes that was our cupboards. I slept on willows on top of a caribou skin. And all of us slept on the floor. We did not have a bed. And that was life. We didn't think we were poor. This was our way of life. And like I said, it was a hard life, but a good life if you were not struck down by the many diseases that began to infect our lives starting in the colonial period after the 1740s. So thank you. That's what I wanted to say for now.
Thank you so much, Willie, for sharing. I appreciate that story. Patuk, I have become a huge fan, and looking at your Twitter bio, I just have to share. Alaskan lady living a balance between Inupiaq Eskimo life and modern American ways. Love to travel, eat, plan, and make differences where I can. I love that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like for you growing up and what makes living in Alaska so unique?
Definitely. So I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s. You know, I'm very blessed to have come from a whaling family. Our family, they go out hunting subsistently for bowhead whales to help feed the community. It's basically family units going out to go and hunt and for our survival. And it's not for anything other than making sure all of those in our community are fed. Our whaling crews are very much the very first food banks of our communities, and we rely heavily on subsistence for not just our sustenance for food, but also spiritual, mental, physical. Our whole lives revolve around the whale. And so as I was growing up in Utkarvik, I truly believed that life was good, great. I thought everywhere in Alaska looked just like where I lived, and they lived exactly like that. But Alaska is so diverse. And I would like to say, because both of my parents worked, I was raised in many ways by PBS. I was raised by Nickelodeon, VH1, MTV. But I tell you what, watching these various TV programming, learning about the world outside of me, I never saw anything in the 80s and 90s that I could identify with. I never saw anybody that looked like me, talked like me, was in line with our values. And in many ways, I questioned my own self-identity as to who am I? I'm an American, I'm an Iñupiaq person. So that led me on this path of self-discovery, of learning more about myself, my family, my community, my region, my state, and how all of the world affects that or doesn't affect that. And beginning to understand that a little bit more really created a hunger within inside me to develop media to help encourage and uplift our own people. And so by some strange way, I became this famous TikToker, as some people like to call it. I don't like to brag. It's not something in our culture that we like to say. We have to remain humble. Otherwise, we will not receive blessings from a higher power, right? But this is probably a good time to segue into more about who we are as a whaling people. So I'll turn it over to the tech team to play this next video.
So let's talk a little bit about whaling crews. Whaling crews are made up of family and extended family. In this picture, you see Savik, who is the whaling captain, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, who are the majority of the whaling crew. These large extended families work together to be able to go out onto the ice and participate in whaling so that they may be able to feed the community. You really have to work hard as a team because there's no way that one person can land a whale alone. We also rely heavily on the community because once a whale is killed, we require the whole community to come out and help pull the whale up. This is really what keeps the fabric of our community strong and together.
And so if I may add a little bit more to that, honestly, this is what has sustained us for thousands of years. And to add to what Willie was saying is that our Inuit people, we span from Russia all the way to Greenland, across the circumpolar north. And there's theories that are based on understanding language and dynamics that a lot of times we like to say that Alaska was the start. That's where all people then begin to travel and move. And I do love to travel and learn about history. And if you look at language and you see how diverse the various languages are, even within the state of Alaska, I mean, we've got 12 regional corporations that are broken down, and it's by cultures and languages. And it's very, I mean, even between my region and Willie's region, there are very definite differences in our language in terms of what words we use for what or how we. I like to say that Willie has a southern twang to the way that he speaks Iñupiaq versus us Yankee northern Iñupiaq people. But I mean, if you look all the way that we've traveled all the way to Greenland, and in Greenland, they very much have almost a singular way of speaking, very much similar. Now you look at the United States of America, you look at the East Coast and you hear the various dialects or accents, even differences from Philadelphia to South Carolina, to Boston, to Florida. And then you know that those people moved westward to California where in California all the way to Washington, most of the people very much sound the same. So if we look at that theory that we moved from Alaska all the way to Greenland, it kind of gives you some idea of our indigenous people within the state that are so very different between us, even all the way down south to Shauna, whether it's the culture, the language, even just the dramatic change in what our landscape looks like and how we've been able to utilize the resources around us to really live. But I mean, I'm a promoter, as you may already can tell, but that shouldn't take away from the very real challenges that we face in rural Alaska, the cost of living, the third world conditions that many people in rural Alaska face. And this is America, this is United States. I would encourage everyone to begin to learn more and understand about the challenges in rural Alaska, in hopes that maybe we can all live a little bit better up to modern day standards, American standards, right? We're not a third world country, we're part of the United States.
Thank you, Patok. While my kids will say your TikTok videos are so cool, I will say they are so profoundly powerful. You have done such an exceptional job of sharing this path of self-discovery and how Alaska is unique, and we can't be more thankful for your talent and the voice that you bring for Alaska Native people. So thank you. Shauna, you are an inspiration to us all. You took the helm of your Native corporation in your 30s, and you have helped guide your corporation to great success today. So I'd like to pivot on this next question to garner your insight. Based on the language of Anxia and the system it established, it's clear that these differences were apparent to Congress 50 years ago, but many people in Congress today lack awareness of our organizations and our people. What are the couple of things you wish today's audience understood about Alaska Native corporations?
Great, thanks, Kim. So before I get into answering your question in particular, I think it's really important for the audience to understand what is the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Well, if you ask Native people, Alaska Native people, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was about us getting fee simple title and access to our traditional homelands. So we wanted to make sure that we owned our land. And to put it in context, at the time in which the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was being passed, there were folks like Willie Hensley that were, the description of how he grew up in rural Alaska. That was where our people were at. That was where our communities are at. So when Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and established Alaska Native corporations, there's 4 things that I really want our audience to take away about that piece of legislation and how Alaska Native corporations and Alaska is different than Indian country in the lower 48. So first, when Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, 50 years ago, the congressional intent of that legislation was that Alaska Native corporations would promote the social, cultural, and economic advancement of Alaska Native people and Alaska Native communities. So while Congress gave us this term of corporations, they intentionally also gave us what would be termed a tribal mandate, right? They expected Alaska Native corporations to be more. They expected us to do more. Next slide, please. The second thing that I'd really like the audience to take away is that our shareholders are different. They're not living in Park Avenue in New York City. They're not in high-rise apartments in LA. Our shareholders are Alaska Native people. Our shares can't be bought or sold. You can't buy them on the stock market. You can't even buy them from an existing shareholder. In fact, the only way you can become a shareholder is if you have an Alaska Native relative who either gifts you or wills you shares. And so this means that our corporations are owned by Alaska Native people, and they're led by all Alaska Native boards of directors. Next slide, please. So the third thing I really would like for you to remember is that while Congress gave us this name corporations, we're not regular for-profit corporations. We are not Apple, Google, Tesla. We're very different. And I can tell lots of stories, and so can the other panelists, about how we're different. But I think one of the best indicators of that is our mission statements. And you could really Google any Alaska Native corporation, and you could find their mission and vision statements online, and they're all going to be similar to the random 3 that I have on this screen here now. But in the interest of time, I want to pick on Ahtna because they have a beautiful mission statement that's very short. And Ahtna's is the wide stewardship of Ahtna land. So they are taking care of their homelands. The entire purpose that the act was passed so that our people could have access to and own our traditional homelands for subsistence purposes. But they're also looking for responsible economic growth. And they're doing that economic growth not only in their communities and for their Alaska Native people, their shareholders, but they're also doing it for future generations of Ahtna people. So Ahtna is a forever corporation. They're really here for multiple generations. And in fact, the generations that we're never going to meet. Next slide, please. So last, but certainly not least, Alaska is different. We're not better, folks. We're not worse. We're just different. And because of our very unique history with the federal government, our tribal designation structure is completely different than what you would see in lower 48 tribal reservations. And for 50 years, Congress has worked with Alaska Native corporations through various pieces of legislation to ensure that we are working to improve the quality of life of rural Alaska and our Alaska Native shareholders. And in turn, Alaska Native corporations are working with this constellation of other organizations, including tribes, housing authorities, nonprofits, tribal health organizations, to ensure that collectively we are improving the quality of life for our people in Alaska. So is Alaska complicated? Absolutely. And I'm really hopeful that as audience members, you'll be able to attend some of the future presentations that we're doing through the Wilson Center and be able to do a deep dive into some of the policies that are impacted by this kind of constellation of organizations. Kayana.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Mike, I think we're going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Boy, that's a tough act to follow. You and these incredible leaders. But I will try. I also want to encourage our colleagues from around the world to join us in this discussion. We're going to have a few more questions from our end, but then we want to invite all of you in. So please remember to email us at polar@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll make sure that your questions, your comments are in there. I would like to come back to Willie for a moment. Before I even arrived in Alaska many decades ago, I knew Willie. And I knew Willie because I had read about Willie, 3,000 plus miles away. And it wasn't just Willie. To use Shauna's example, there were a constellation of Alaska Native leaders upon which a state was reshaped. And if you look at overall economies, the economic drivers in our state, the maturity of our state, even though we have so many challenges, as Pathak has noted, we have so many challenges. What if? What if there weren't Willie Hensleys? What if there weren't those constellation of Alaska Native leaders who reshaped not just rural Native Alaska, but reshaped what became a state? What if? And so, Willie, thank you. Of course, you are a leader for all of us in our state, not just for the Native community. You are Alaska for our state. You are a leader for our state, and in fact, our nation. Your voice is heard across whatever favorite ocean you'd like to travel over. So your voice and your vision, permeates beyond our state and beyond our nation. But listening to Shauna, Pathak, Kim, this is another generation that you helped advance, right? Many generations. I am the benefit of your work, of your vision, of your labor. So I would like to ask you to build on Shauna's comments. What are your reflections now, 50 years, I don't mean to age you, my friend, but 50 years on, what do you think back on, and what transformations have our Alaska Native corporations made, and has it met the mark? Has what you were trying to do become an even, we're not perfect, but maybe more perfect vision or more helpful vision as to where our state, but most importantly, our Native communities should be and need to be?
Well, thank you. I didn't know you knew me that well. And, you know, my mind just begins to race when you talk about people that I've worked with now, you know, over 50 years ago. I was literally 24, 25 when I got completely immersed in this whole issue of who owned Alaska. And the popular assumption was among the pioneer types who brought statehood was that we didn't have any rights, and that they were going to be permitted to take over 100 million acres of our land without any compensation. That is what I learned in a short little paper at the University of Alaska. All of a sudden, I understood, you know, based on my reading of the Indian era, the treaties, the Treaty of Cession. I had no comprehension about what colonization really meant. I looked at all the laws, all the way down to the Statehood Act, from the Treaty of Cession on to the Organic Acts, and to the law that made us citizens in 1924, to the Indian Reorganization Act that created all of our tribes. And then when I looked at the Statehood Act, I realized, oh my God, they're stealing our land. And our people didn't understand this is exactly what was happening. And so needless to say, with an understanding like that, I couldn't keep it to myself. And so I borrowed $10 to buy, no, $20 to buy stamps as a student then, and had no money whatsoever. And I used that $20 to buy stamps to write our 11 villages, to say, and this is in English. I took what I learned and tried to compress it into ordinary language, which was Inupiat in those days, but people could read English. And they posted this letter to the post office in the village blackboard or the village store. And that was what precipitated our claim of about 30 million acres in the summer of '66. Now, this began to happen all over Alaska. And that little paper, E. took Edwardson from Barrow, when we first organized the Alaska Federation of Natives in the fall of '66, he printed out my paper so we all knew and felt that this was our land. We didn't know any other paper trail of what had transpired historically. And that gave them and gave me and others, you know, an inkling of what the legalities were. And the fact is that we realized that the Congress of the United States had never extinguished our underlying title. And that was what we could, you know, we had many, many differences. Alaska is very big, and there was different, different cultures, exposure to the Western world. Some of us were more traditional than others. We had absolutely no idea about private property, about deeds, about promissory notes, about surveys. I mean, this was a different world, you know, and all of a sudden we were facing it. And the reality was that literally we were on the verge of losing control of our space. And that was what drove us to the formation of the Alaska Federation of Natives. And I walk every day, and I saw Emil Nadi walking. He's in his 80s now, and he was our leader. He was our host in the fall of '66 here in Anchorage. And when we first got together, the first time statewide representatives from all the different cultures, united by the fact that we're about to lose our space. And so we had absolutely no interest in corporations per se. We had absolutely no idea where we were going to end up. All we knew was that we were fighting 200 years American history of taking native lands. And then the methodologies of compensation were really completely inadequate. I mean, it was laughable. The whole Court of Claims process and the Indian Claims Commission process took many, many years, and you ended up with just a few cents an acre and no land. And so we knew that if we were going to end up with any land whatsoever, we had to change 200 years of American history. And we did it with very little comprehension of history, of the law. Initially, we had no lawyers, we had no money, we had no communication system. All we had was a post office. And yet, I think desperation pretty much drew people together. And we fought right down to the bitter end. But in the end, I mean, you know, you're outside the door and they're inside the door cutting the deal, right? And so people don't understand where the corporation came from. Well, the reality is we sort of invited it in a sense, because two things. If Alaska, the state of Alaska wasn't going to play ball, there was no legislation. And we're back to that old system that where the Tlingit and Haida spent 35 years in court. They got a measly $7.5 million for some of the most beautiful timberland in the country and no land whatsoever. That's what we were going to be facing. And so, but also we had to keep a united front on the native side. If the natives weren't united, that was a killer. Congress was going to not deal with it. So those two situations actually resulted in what emerged. Because if we went to the state, and in fact, Governor Hickel created a task force, which I chaired, which involved the entire AFN board in 1968, and we actually were desperate to try to inch the state forward towards a settlement because they'd found the oil in 1968, and we thought we were going to get run over. If they got the pipeline without a land settlement, we're never going to get a settlement. The reality, right? And so the state, we got Uncle Wally Hickel, our governor, to agree to the 40 million acres. That was while he was still governor. We also got him to commit to the idea of state participation in the financial settlement because they found the oil. They knew there was at least 10 billion barrels. And so those two major things, we got the state to agree to. And so what happens? Nixon appoints our arch enemy. He was fighting us on the land freeze. We stopped the state selections with the help of Stuart Udall, bless his soul, the secretary. He helped us stop the state selections. And without that land freeze, we were going to be forgotten, you know? And so that was the background. If we had come up and said we wanted 200 reservations, that was a deal killer. But the idea, we were becoming familiar with nonprofit corporations. And so, but the ideas that Senator Jackson and the committee of Senate Interior Committee were getting from a group that he commissioned, Joe Fitzgerald's commission up here, they were going to recommend a presidential appointed massive commission that was going to hold all the land and the money. They were going to issue stock to natives. And in 10 years, it was going to be public. We wouldn't have even had a regional corporation or village corporation. And this was a group that had the ear of the chairman of the Senate Interior Committee, Senator Jackson. And so, and then on the other hand, you had the BIA Interior Department types who wanted to control us through the BIA, you know? So we were in a box, so to speak. And so we had to fight like heck just to have the corporation that we could control where the land and the money, and so that we wouldn't have to go to the federal government to do anything, right? And so that's how we ended up with a corporation. It was something like our idea, but our whole goal in life was to get the land. The land, because we are identified with the land after 10,000 years. It's our homeland, and you have to have the land to maintain your culture and your spirit, you know, and that continuity. And so, but, you know, once the door is shut in Congress, you're outside there and they're inside doing the deal. And we ended up actually, subsistence, hunting and fishing was one of our major objectives, but when in the end, it wasn't even in there. And yet, with the help of Richard Nixon, we had gotten Congress to pass a bill, and we never thought that we could ever get the forces together to get a bill through Congress again. And we are desperately afraid of being shunted off to the Court of Claims. If the country had got the right of way for the pipeline, we would have been forgotten. So we sort of had to accept, what Congress did. But subsequent to that, though, you talk about identity. Somebody was talking about, Patrick was talking about maintaining her sense of identity and Inupiaq spirit and connection to the people. Well, needless to say, colonization is all about trying to destroy that. And of course, that's something that we never fully understood, with the whole boarding school system that kind of beats your language out of you, beats your family connections. So when we got the corporation, we actually were we weren't celebrating, despite the fact that 5 years of battle every day, with one hand tied behind our back, so to speak. When we got that settlement, it was a phenomenal accomplishment in retrospect in terms of our national history, but we're almost crying because we knew what we were giving up. But yet we decided to try to make it work. And so in my region, I think we're the first to try to find a way to indigenize the corporation. And we did it through, we kept doing business, but we literally, our entire leadership and board focused on the maintenance and the resurrection of what we call the Inupiat spirit. Inupiat Ilitkuset, we call it. What we realized was that we still had a lot to offer in terms of our own value system, our own way of life, that still had a great deal of value, and all we had to do is find a way to put that spirit into the corporation. That is, the goal of the corporation is not the bottom line in itself. It is just a tool, actually just like the tribal system is a tool. It's a white man's idea about how we should be organized, right? And so the idea was to use that tool to uplift our people. And that's what we've been trying to do in our villages and in our regions, was to put our spirit and our values into it and use it not as an end, but as a means to uplifting our people. So that's my message.
Willie, thank you so much. I am so pleased we're recording this, because there's absolutely no way I could communicate what Patak, Shauna, and Kim have talked about. And then this arc of this evolution that you have helped to bring about. There's no way for any of us who haven't lived it, have experienced it from the outside, but there's absolutely no way to communicate it in the way that you do and how you do it. And we're able to see the beneficiaries of you and that, sorry, Shauna, that constellation of leadership, like Patak, who I'd like to go to. Because I think what Willie has outlined for us is not just a native corporation structure. He's outlined for us the evolution of a different way of thinking about controlling destiny against all odds, against a lot of different kind of waves of influence. And many in rural Alaska now have, it's not perfect, but there is a structure to work with, and it's led by Native communities. Again, not perfect. But Shauna outlined services and the mission and the vision, and this is not PepsiCo. This is not Amazon. These corporations are built for and serve the people. Patak, so for you, I know you have a passion about a number of things, including food security, right? Water security. People think security and they're thinking hard power conflict. Can you just take what Willie has outlined for us, just one small component? And I want to talk about food security for a moment and what that means to you and your community, the role of the corporation in that. And I'm sure you have a TikTok that addresses that, maybe queued up with Michaela, I think. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I think it's important because food ties you to landscape, ties you to culture, ties you to the rhythm of the environment. It goes beyond just eating, correct? So I'd like to just leave that there and ask you for your thoughts.
Well, I tell you what, our Indigenous people are no stranger to food insecurity. Many times people will say that we're a feast or famine type of culture. And honestly, we rely so much on our leadership. Folks like Willie, who have helped pave the way to create these organizations so that we may flourish, that we can use this outside system for our benefit. But of course, there's still going to be some people that are struggling. And so it is so very important to understand all of the organizations that serve Alaska and trying to find the best path to work together to help our people. And so that's honestly, if I had not studied and read books about Willie or other leadership in Alaska, I would have no idea as to what powers are at my fingertips. And I've been lucky enough to work in various organizations that have allowed me to begin to study and learn more, because I didn't learn about this in public school. I had to wait till I was in college. However, because I've studied mass communications and rural development in the undergrad and graduate level, I've been able to utilize technology to help spread the message about food insecurity in our communities in rural Alaska. So if Michaela wants to cue up that video.
This is the Arctic, where the Inuit people have hunted off the land and sea to survive. Now, we do have a store that ships in food via airplane and barge in the summertime, but the prices are prohibitively expensive. These are the prices in the Hub community store. Now, I want to let you know that the prices in the villages are sometimes twice these costs. Although we have these stores, not everyone can afford the food that is sold in them. This creates a great deal of food insecurity in the Arctic, and this is just what we have to live with. I mean, look, $60 for some chuck roast. I think a lot of people just don't realize how remote the Arctic actually is. This is my hometown of Utqiagvik, Alaska, and our way of life might be different than what you live and breathe every day. I just want you to respect that.
So just to quickly add to that, the economics of our state is not something that's a small bubble, not affected by anything. The economics of our state have largely been by resource development, oil development, and all of this trickles down into how our leaders can then support our communities to live well. And so honestly, all of these things at play with federal administration, state administration, they affect us when we're an oil producing state. And the cost of these things, some people have said on social media, well, why don't you just move? What? Why would we just move? Some people can't even afford to move. I mean, we're in Utqiagvik, it's 700 air miles away from the largest city, hub city in Alaska. That affects the economics of the prices up there. Also, I mean, depending on if it's a good year for oil or resource development for all of our regional corporations, and then dependent on what programs and grants are available, I mean, it dramatically can affect life in Point Lay, Alaska, or Port Lions, I mean, all of these bigger economics can affect our villages. And I think it's so very wrong for people to say, well, just move. That's not the answer. The answer is understanding our organizations that serve us and working together to find the means to the end so that we can thrive and live well.
Well said. And I knew we had a TikTok that would hit the mark, and that certainly did, especially, I mean, for many of those who travel throughout rural Alaska, those prices are obviously real. And it's something, Shauna, that maybe I can ask you to weigh in on. So Patak, again, thank you for setting the scene. But two questions. So one is a surprise question. and one is something we've talked about, which is COVID-19, which I do want to talk about. I'm also watching Kim. We have some questions coming in, so I'll interject a few of those. But Shauna, listening to what Patak just said, you as a leader of one of these corporations, that is a, for lack of better terms, a weighty situation here, right? This is not PepsiCo. I don't want to pick on PepsiCo, but any pick your favorite company. This goes far beyond that, right? This is sustainability and moving from sustainable community to a thriving community. This is not nice to have. These are services and resources and basic life needs that you think about as a leader of one of these corporations, as do all of our corporations. How do you balance this? How do you position to keep one foot in this really important cultural tied to landscape world, subsistence world, and yet go out there and try to build a Western corporation that builds nets underneath and then lifts these kind of communities? Because that's what Patak just showed us. These are not nice to haves. I mean, having meat on your table is a good thing. And I realize there's wonderful caribou and fish and whale, and it's all good. But there are other services that you must provide as well. Right. And then I'll come back to the COVID question in a moment. And Kim, jump in whenever you would like.
Well, Mike, we love surprise questions. So thanks for that. Yeah, I think, it's a balance that every Alaska Native person deals with every day, right? Like, how do we maintain our cultural, alutiiq, in my case, values? And then how do we also be successful in like mainstream American corporate culture? And I think at Koniak and at all Alaska Native corporations, we have core values, and those core values are rooted in our cultural values, right? And so that really drives our companies, and making sure that, as we're looking at diversification, as we're looking at investments, as we're looking at opportunities to grow the economic success of our companies for the future generations of our Alaska Natives, that we know that we're not just doing that so that we can, in Coca-Cola's case, pay a dividend to their shareholders, but that we're also doing that so that we can make enough money so that we can pay an elder benefit, and that elder benefit is going to go to an elder who lives in a village and needs that money to pay their heating bill for the winter. We recognize that we're doing that so that we can award scholarships to children in kindergarten so that they can join their T-ball team. That's our mission. That's why we're doing what we're doing. And I think as Alaska Native people, as boards of directors and as organizations, by staying rooted in our cultural values, that's how we're driving that change in our communities. The other thing is through partnership, right? So Alaska Native corporations don't do this on our own. Absolutely not. We work in partnership with that whole constellation of organizations. And those organizations are led by our Alaska Native people with the same values that we have, right? So at the end of the day, tribal health organizations, tribes, nonprofits are all working for the quality of life or betterment of our people. And that's what we're here for. And we get to go to bed every night knowing that we made a positive difference in the lives of someone. Life doesn't get any better than that, right?
It doesn't get any better than that. Absolutely. Let me ask you, I want to do three things. Kim, let me pause here before we ask maybe Shauna to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on the state, on Native communities. But let me ask you if you have any questions or themes that you want to carry forward, because I do want to do a lightning round of questions. We've got about a half hour left. I do want to get to some of these questions, and we'll do it in the most precise way. And then also just heads up to everybody listening in that we're also going to wrap up with a last video from Patak at the end, just a few minutes before we end, which I think would be a wonderful way to bring it to a wrap. But Kim, anything that you would like to interject?
No, Mike, I think we are on a great roll, and I don't want to stop any progress of these conversations. So please carry forward. Okay. Well, then, thank you. So Shauna, Patak, please weigh in. Kim, weigh in. But COVID certainly, of course, we all know the story. And every part of the world has a different story. We have a story. Rural Alaska, Native Alaska has a story. My story, Shauna, just to kick you off, is that throughout this last year, the Wilson Center has had dozens and dozens of programs. We've done it all from our homes and our offices. And if
if nothing has highlighted at least one issue, there's many, it's been broadband connectivity. Boy, it has, we used to try to put a spotlight on the issue that in the Arctic, a lot of places, there isn't a digital divide, there's a digital abyss, and that abyss has to be taken care of. And so COVID put a heat lamp, not a spotlight, on this issue of connectivity. That's one. But I know there are other issues related to COVID that Native communities have been dealing with. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are, before I get started, I want to recognize that every community, whether you're in Alaska, the lower 48, or somewhere else in the globe, has been impacted by COVID-19. And if there's a member of our audience who maybe lost a family member due to COVID, my heart goes out to you, and you're in my thoughts and prayers. This has been an incredible, difficult and challenging year for all of us. And I'm so happy that we're in 2021, and hopefully that means we're coming to the end of COVID-19. But let's talk a little bit about some of the unique challenges that we've had in Alaska. Broadband is part of infrastructure, so that brings me into what I think of as the most impactful on why we have unique challenges to COVID-19 in Alaska. So if we could pull up my slide, that would be incredibly helpful. Number 7, technical delay. So as we talk about COVID-19, what I think of is perhaps our greatest challenge is the geographic remoteness and distance to our state. So Alaska, when you look at it superimposed on a map of the continental US, spans literally from California to Florida, from Canada down to Texas. So we are huge. And, as Alaskans, we like to tease our friends in Texas and tell them that their state is our cute little sister. But all joking aside, next slide, the size of Alaska really can make building infrastructure, whether that's broadband, whether that's roads or other things, extremely challenging in rural Alaska. So you can see on this slide, transportation, because it's an incredible example of the challenge of building infrastructure in Alaska. In all of the state, the orange portion of this map are the only portions of the state that are actually connected by road or by railroad. So the entire rest of the state, the majority of Alaska, is not connected by car. So the only way you can get to places like my region is either by airplane or by boat. So this means many of the villages in Alaska don't have basic things like running water, regular access to dentists or doctors, or even grocery stores. Next slide. So I thought maybe as we talk about COVID-19, I could highlight food insecurity. I know some of the other panelists have talked about this, but I think it's very unique in not food insecurity because of the pandemic is not unique. That's felt all across the globe, but I would say the way in which we felt it in Alaska is very unique. In particular, in my region, none of my villages are connected by road. And so that means for people in our community to get to the grocery store, because most of our villages do not have grocery stores, they actually have to board a very small prop plane and fly to the nearest city. And so extraordinary isolation. So when we talk about COVID-19's impact on food security, I'd really invite you to put your mindset back to where you were at in like April of last year, right? So when people in cities like Anchorage and Washington, D.C. were terrified to get in their personal cars and drive to the grocery store for fear of contracting COVID and then bringing it home to their families. In our communities, there was no way to social distance. There was no way for people to get on an airplane and go and safely buy groceries. And this was really compounded because at the height of the pandemic in Alaska, which was last spring and through the summer, most of the subsistence food resources in people's freezers were beginning to run out, right? So people were having difficulty accessing things that maybe they would have been able to access in the fall. And then, of course, the fish hadn't yet started running in our rivers. So we at Koniak had a real concern in our region about food insecurity. So we partnered with a tribal health organization in our region and literally put together boxes of food and put them on airplanes. We packed up entire airplanes and flew them out to each village on a regular schedule to deliver groceries out to our people. But at Koniak, we recognized that food insecurity could be a long-standing problem in our communities, right? So we didn't know how long COVID was going to last. Right at the beginning, we were all told, hey, this is a 2-week hunker down, right? And then here we are over a year later, and we're still going through it. So Koniak actually partnered with the tribes in each one of our villages to expand their community gardens. So we were focused on building more hoop houses, more raised beds, so that we could have access to fresh fruits and vegetables in our communities. But some of our villages really did some innovative things, like bring in beehives so they could have fresh honey, even bring in some chickens so they can have different types of meat in the winter when maybe their fish had run out. So really exciting ways in which we addressed food insecurity in a unique way in Alaska. Now, I've taken the time to highlight some of those things that we did in our region, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to say that Alaska Native corporations all across Alaska partnered with tribe and tribal health organizations and delivered services to ensure that our people were safe. In interior Alaska, Doyon partnered, or actually they stood up temporary housing for some of their folks who maybe had been exposed to COVID-19, so they wouldn't take it home to their family members. When we talk about broadband in our region in Koniak, we provided scholarships. We adjusted our scholarship program so children kindergarten through 12th grade could get scholarships to cover their broadband bill so that they would have access to the same level of education, Zooming with their teachers, that every other American student has a right to receive. So I think we are facing unique challenges. We're not the only people who have challenges as a result of COVID, but I think the most important thing about COVID is going to be the economic recovery for Alaska. The New York Times recently produced a report that showed that Alaska is the hardest hit economically in the nation from COVID. So we have a huge uphill battle to recover. And I think Alaska Native corporations are really going to be critical in that recovery over the long term.
Thank you, Shauna, and thank you for allowing me to call an audible and insert questions that we had not talked about before. We appreciate that. Kim, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and then we'll get to maybe a few questions before we wrap up.
Great, thanks so much. Willie, I just wanted to pivot back to you quickly too, and talk about our Alaska Native corporations today and your insight of what our Native corporations are doing for our shareholders, for our communities. As someone that laid the groundwork 50 years ago, what's your impression today, and what can you share with us today?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, thank you. I figured out how to get my desktop connected. my other vehicle was running out of power. Anyway, when we started out, of course, here was this new thing. I mean, what do we do with it? How do we go about it? Well, what we did was we hired my nephew, actually, who had experience in an office. He was in the National Guard, and so he was familiar with. None of us were really that familiar with office work, right? That was kind of soft stuff in our world, right? Somebody staying in a warm place, messing around with paper while we're out there, in a tough old world there, cold, and driving the dogs, finding the food. And so in any case, Johnny was not college educated. I mean, most of our people were hunters and housewives and fishermen that were on the board, virtually no education of any consequence, just boarding school education. Anyway, so we started, we had tough timelines. We had to get our land selected within a short period of time. So we had to set up an office. You had to incorporate, we had to elect a board of directors. We had to start trying to figure it out. And our people were very accommodating, we just worked together to try to figure it out. But of course, one of our main ideas was to try to create opportunity for people to earn income. Because you saw those, back then it was even more expensive. There was no sources to gain cash other than fur and maybe a little construction in the summer, or maybe going to
Bristol Bay to work in the canneries hundreds of miles away. So we started doing something locally. We set up a fish processing operation for just the summer months, gave people a chance to earn some, not big income, but some. And then we got into the reindeer business, right? We had up to 10,000 head at one point. Then we built a hotel, even though we're at the kind of the tail end of the tourist world, very expensive, but still it was created a lot of jobs. We built a museum, gave our elders a chance to perform and to sell their artifacts and stuff. So we did things that didn't make a lot of business sense, but we had to do something to let people know that there was something beneficial with this deal, right? And so we actually ended up having to go up to the North Slope, where the oil activity was, to begin to learn how to bid for projects. And actually, I got us into oil and gas drilling. We got into utilities, we got into food service, we got into hotel type operations, revegetation, whatever it took. And that's what we began to do to give people an opportunity to benefit from the initial corporation. And then, of course, back then we were limited. Under Congress, we had like less than 5,000 shareholders, maybe 4,500. Well, the question was, well, what about our family, our members of our family who were not connected? They didn't have stock. And so we communicated tremendously with our people, and they eventually decided to allow those born after 1971 to become registered and shareholders. So now we have like almost 15,000 shareholders, triple what we started out with. So how many people in the world actually vote to dilute the value of their shares? Well, we did, because we wanted our people to be they're part of the land, they're part of us. And then we had other major issues. We actually built the world's biggest zinc and lead mine. God provided us this resource, and we didn't know what to do with it initially, but that one mine has produced $1.5 billion to share with all 12 corporations. We only get to keep about 36%. That was part of the deal that we made in Washington, to keep the Native people together, because we knew there were going to be losers and winners. And then we merged 10 villages into Nana, because the opportunity for business out there was, back then in the early 70s, was very minimal. I mean, there was the village store, and that was about it, And so we really had to go outward. We had to go up to the North Slope. We had to begin doing business around the state. We had to start doing construction. And so that is, I think, a story very similar to other regions, where we are not just confined to our little village now, or even our region. We're statewide, and now many are global. And so unlike many Alaskan enterprises that are owned outside, we're bringing revenue into Alaska to distribute to our shareholders and to create economic opportunity. And that was really phenomenal. I mean, it is far beyond any of us ever even imagined back then. I mean, we didn't even imagine a corporation, really, but that was what emerged. And so outfits like Nana and Arctic Slope, we put a high premium on providing opportunities for our people to gain skills and to be employed. Between the two of us, we have over 6,000 Alaskan-based employees, and many, many more thousands kind of based outside of Alaska. So it has really revolutionized Alaska, because Alaska would have, the United States government would have owned virtually all but that 100 million acres that they were going to give to the state, out of the 365 million. So in my mind, if the urban Alaskans had only understood our vision, they should have backed us for another 10 or 20 or 30 million acres of land. Because now that land is locked up in a park. It's wonderful to have parks, but we have almost 200 million acres of parks as it is, and refuges, you know. And so anyway, I think Alaskan Native corporations have become really an integral part and a growing part of Alaska's economy as a consequence of that land settlement way back. And thanks to Richard Nixon, bless his soul.
Thank you, Willie, for that. A note to that, I mean, that's fantastic. And look where we are today. A note that our friends at the Wilson Center, and thanks Jared and team for this, the response to this discussion has been incredible. So we're going to call another audible, and if everybody hangs with us, we're going to go about 10 minutes over, if that's okay, because there's just lots here to cover. I want to remind everyone that we wanted today's program to do just this, broad-based, but give you a lot of information, but tease on a number of issues that we together, all of us working on this, will now shape, and we will hold a number of programs and events in this series. So a lot of the themes that you've heard about today, they are far more complex, they're far more integrated and far more important than we were able to give time to. So just know that the questions coming in and the themes we have touched upon, those will be covered in future programs like this. I think we've learned that 90 minutes is just not going to cut it. So we'll probably expand the timing a little bit. But this really has done what at least I think we all were wanting to do. So with that, I'd like to do a couple of things. One is, so we have 10 more minutes or so. Petak, I wonder if you can talk about questions. I'm trying to combine a number of questions here, but you know, your social media platform is pretty robust, and we'll end our program with one of your videos. But can you talk a little bit about how to teach or work with artists, use social media, like you have done, and maybe it's for Indigenous communities, but not a little bit, because a number of questions have come in along those lines.
Okay, so I would like to say that, you know, currently I serve as the executive director of the Arctic Slope Community Foundation. And so for any of our watchers, I would encourage you to check out our website and learn more about our region and who we serve. But I've also worked in economic development under Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. And they had a department that is not a money-making department. We were looked at like the expense, but it was created there to help our region, help our people become more financially independent outside of the jobs our corporations can offer, the dividends that we receive, etc. They created a department to help make sure that our people can understand the way the world works in terms of money, and help support them with education and learning opportunities, so that folks like our artists, our Inupiaq artists that work with materials that are carrying on traditions of hundreds of years of creating these various items out of baleen, ivory, etc. They're experts in this, and they've devoted their lives to this. However, you know, when we're in a worldwide pandemic, how are they gonna sell their artwork to tourists if no one can travel, if no one can leave their homes? So we've spent many hours working, many days, many hours, weeks working with our artists so that they can understand how to use social media to benefit and make sales. And that's not always the easiest thing when you're working with people over 50 that specialize in something that's a handmade item. But we've been able to teach, and I mean, I tell you what, times have been sort of tough anyways before COVID. And so COVID just added a whole other layer. There's a video I'd like to queue up with Amos Lane. He was only able to make, I think, 1 or 2 sales until we met with him in December and showed him how to use digital media to make sales. And this man has had a long, hard life journey. And But he was willing and open to learn about this so that he could support his family. Anyways, the video will speak for itself.
This is Amos Lane and his small business Kapayus Kali. Amos is a survivor of trauma and loss, yet he works hard every single day to support his family. Due to COVID-19, his doors have had to remain closed for much of 2020, and this has greatly affected his business. He's only made a few sales, so pieces like this one have largely been unseen. I encourage you to take the time to check his business out and consider purchasing artwork from him so that this style of carving may continue on. Koniak.
And so if I could just add to that a little bit, COVID has challenged our whole world to think and act differently. And I want to mention that I feel for all of those that have suffered loss, that have been affected by the downturn in the economy. And things have been tough, even with food security in our region. I tell you what, we've got food banks that they purchase food, bring them in and distribute to the community, those that are at need. The need has gone up tremendously, but I think that we would have been suffering even more if it wasn't for a very successful year in subsistence, hunting, fishing, gathering. 2020 actually was very good for us in terms of subsistence. However, I want to remind all of the listeners that at one point, whaling, subsistence whaling was illegal for our region to do. The International Whaling Commission put a ban on all whaling activities in the 70s. And by way of policy, that could have wiped us out if we had not had the means and the organization set up to fight this ban and carry out what we believe is our God-given right to live, survive, and thrive in one of the harshest climates in the world. And so policies at that level, national, international, they can affect us down to our survival and livelihood. And I want to mention that if it had not been for leadership at the federal level advocating for us at the last International Whaling Commission meeting, we may have struggled, but we were able to get whaling rights in perpetuity, a quota for us to continue to go hunting subsistently. This is, this is nothing ever bought, sold, etc. So, I mean, it's really like folks like Willie, Shauna, our leadership at this level, we have to remain at the cutting edge of what policies are happening nationwide, international, statewide, and start to pay attention as to, is this good for us? Is this bad for us? How is this going to affect people in our smallest, most remote villages, only accessible by plane, and not even accessible by plane every single day, thanks to the Alaskan weather system that we have? Oh, looks like we're queuing up another video.
This is, it's a good program when I have no idea what's coming next. So go ahead. We have about 10 minutes left, so this is just fine. Thank you.
So this is an umak, or a skin boat. This is a handmade boat with a wooden frame and 8 to 12 bearded seal skins sewn together using a waterproof stitch. It is all natural materials down to the thread, which is made from the tendons of caribou. The bearded seals must be caught a year in advance. The meat, the blubber, and the internal organs are harvested for food, but the skin is saved and it undergoes a controlled rot to where the hair falls off. The expert seamstresses of the community then gather together to sew the bearded sealskins together. The men then take the skins and put it over the wooden frame. This entire process can take over 24 hours. After it's strapped on, it will go outside to cure. The boat then sits until it's ready to be used.
Someone said, wow, I never heard that terminology, controlled rot. But, you know, we must pay attention to things all throughout the year. There's a seasonal calendar. The tendons from the caribou, they must be harvested in the summer, dried out, and then prepared to sew on the skin boat. The bearded seals must be caught in the summer before. I mean, there's all of these various facets of our culture that we have to plan and prepare for. And just similarly with our various organizations and positions, we have to do the same thing. So it is very much living in two worlds for us. And it's something that is largely unknown through mainstream media. So without TikTok or other, you know, social media sites, I think most people would not know. I think most people still don't know. I encourage you guys to check out my TikTok, the shameless plug. It's at Patrick Glenn on TikTok if you want to learn more. And I'm just going to be quiet and let the rest of the people do the talking from here on out.
Patrick, I think that was really, I'm glad you all took over the program, because I think that's really important. We're talking about the evolution here, Willie providing some great experiences of what it was like before we were a state, and then the evolution of our Native communities and how it has evolved over time, the creation of a corporate structure, and down the road, others who will join us will understand what we're talking about. These are Native corporations that have offices in Alaska, but they have offices in countries and in regions that you would not even imagine. These are robust Native corporations that have diverse portfolios, all coming back to serve communities. And Patak, what you just did is, I think, really brought into really fine tuning to show us this living in both worlds, right? The rhythm of life cycles and subsistence cycles in the very region that we have a very large regional corporation that are doing the very things that Shauna and Kim and Willie have talked about. So I think that was perfect. Again, we've got about 8 minutes left. There are so many questions here. We'll book them. We'll bring them forward for our next program. Kim, let me ask you if you want to weigh in here before I ask one last question. And when I ask that one last question, we'd ask each of our panelists to give us just a 1 minute answer to it. And I'll prep you by saying the answer is, the question is, 50 years from now, what's your vision, your hope for what this Alaska Native Corporation structure can and should do for the communities that they currently serve? That's a big question. So think about it for a moment. Kim, let me turn it back to you to see if there's anything you'd like to follow up on. Then we'll go back to the question, and then we'll have one of Patak's videos play us out.
Well, I'll just very quickly then, since we're going to close out with Patrick's video, I will say my closing remarks and thank everyone for participating today. I could go on listening to the three of you for weeks. And I am just so thankful for you for sharing your tremendous stories. My heart is full today. It's just been a wonderful experience to share the screen with you all today. I also want to thank everyone for virtually joining us for this event. We certainly hope that you've gained a deeper understanding of our state and its way of life and how unique we are and how these realities come to light. So we hope that you'll join us for our next session. I think that today certainly showcased that we have a lot more to talk about and a lot more to share. And there'll be a next session coming that dives a little bit deeper into Anxia and to celebrate the progress that's been achieved by our Alaska Native people and our communities over the last 50 years of what's to come. Also, finally, I will just say on behalf of ARA and ANVCA, I want to give one last koyana and thank you to Mike, to the rest of the team at the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. This team has been wonderful to work with, and we're really looking forward to the next event. So hopefully I stalled long enough to give our panelists time to answer the lightning questions. So ready, set, go.
Thank you, Kim. And it's been an absolute pleasure. And as we all know, Michaela Stith, who's there in Anchorage, has been the key to making this all happen. And our full broadcast facility, those guys, Jared and team, thank you so much for making this all work so very well, as throwing curveballs at you. So back to the question. Maybe Patak, let's start with you. We've got about a minute each, and then we'll go back to your video. 50 years from now, what do you hope our Native corporations are doing for the communities?
Well, you know, being called something else by CNN during this election season tells me that we are still very much misunderstood, or no one really knows who we are or how we live. And my hopes are that, for starters, we as the younger generation and generations after us have a complete understanding of who we are, where we've come from, the organizations that serve us, so that they may be able to take the reins and continue to work and provide for our people. And also, I think that it's so important that the rest of the world understands who we are and know that things that they do and how they live can affect us even in the most remote parts of America. And I would only hope that by understanding and knowing that people would make informed choices to do the right thing, right? You know, and help one another, as we in Native communities just naturally do by way of survival. If we did not help one another, we would not even be here to this day. So that's something that I really fully believe in and am passionate about.
Thank you. Willie, I'm going to go with the 50-year benchmark. You brought us forward from 50 years ago. So it's a nice bridge now to ask you for your comments. And then Shauna, I'm coming to you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I feel that it is absolutely critical that our people retain their sense of identity and cultural spirit. Even though things change, there are some things that should never change, and our value system is one of those. I have felt for 40 years that if we don't maintain our identity, we are going to lose our land and our corporations eventually. So my hope is that we retain our sense of identity and connection to the land, and that our corporations are successful, and that they do provide opportunities for our people, also to protect the land, because in the end, that's the land that has enabled us to thrive. As hard as it is, it's our homeland, and every people need a homeland. Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. Shauna?
Yeah, so there's three things that I wrote down in response to your question, Mike. First, in 50 years from now, we should own our homelands. Second, I would look for self-sufficient people and self-sufficient communities, and I think our Alaska Native corporations are going to be really critical partners in that effort. And third, but certainly not least, is this knowing who we are and where we're going. And so also, you know, hopeful that our friends in the lower 48, whether they be tribes or members of Congress or their staffers, that they have an understanding about what makes Alaska unique and why our people are different.
I'm glad I gave you that time. It's perfect. So here's what I'd like to do with the remaining couple of minutes, is to Michaela, go to the video of Anaktuvuk Pass that Patak has provided for us, and then when we're done with that, just come back to me for a minute to wrap up. Is that okay? I guess it is. Okay, good. Patak, do you want to just give us 15 seconds? What were we looking at?
I just wanted to let people know this is what Alaska looks like in much of our state right now. And if anyone's been following the news, the Northern Lights have been amazing. This community is one of the most remote in the state. It's in the Brooks Range, the heart of the Brooks Range. It's called Anaktuvuk Pass. And we have a lot of humor in our language. It literally means the pass of shit, where the caribou, the caribou are, you know, their droppings are there. But that is, I mean, that is an excellent spot for them to survive, to subsist off of the caribou in the most remote community. But I could go on and talk. I better.
That's okay. Well, thank you, and thank you for the explanation of the naming of that pass. It's a beautiful pass. Can't wait to get back home and seeing some of those northern lights. Let me thank
Mike. There's only one other thing she forgot to mention when she was talking about the umiak, and that is, when I was a boy, the women used to use human urine to take the hair off the skin. So we learned chemistry way back then.
Okay. It's obvious we have reached the end of this program, but Kim, I think actually, you know, this might be an issue, a theme we follow on, is that this traditional knowledge, the way of using the landscape, as we've just heard, might be something else we tease out, because these are not just jokes and passing phrases. This is a rhythm and a way of life that I would like to investigate further. So Willie, thank you for bringing that up. Let me thank you all for once again being a part of this very first event in a series that we hope will grow, will inform. You can see many of the policy implications here, but these policy implications are because real life issues are happening. So we want to make sure that we bring this nexus of what is really happening, define the policy issues, and then address those policy issues. So the very issues that we've talked about today about aspirations for the future, we can actually have an informed set of discussions about what a future looks like, defined by those who actually live there. So to my friends and colleagues, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. To the 500 plus people who registered with us, thank you very much for your interest. To my friends back at the studio, Trayvon, Jared, Stacy, thank you so much for your work. Michaela, can't do this without you. Thank you very much. And we'll be back soon. This will be posted online after the program or tomorrow, so it'll be available. Thank you all very much for just making us better today. Thank you all.
Quiana.